Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Welcome to another video. It's been a while again. I have an excuse though. I've had a ton throughout the spring. I had basically daily day tours that I was doing. Then I went to Spain for 2 weeks to guide my tour there, and then I was home for like 3 days, and I went on to Montana, which I just got back from my birds and mammals tour in Montana. So I've been really busy. And I know all of you are busy too, so thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. And what is this video about? It's about something that I keep hearing from people. I keep hearing from people that the R3 doesn't have enough resolution, and then combine it with the 100 to 500 RF, Canon 100 to 500 RF, which is too slow at 500 millimeters. It's 7.1. You put the 1.4 times teleconverter on it, which I do a lot, and you get the 700 millimeters, and it's f10, so it's no good unless the light is really good. So what did I do? I went to Spain for 2 weeks almost, and then to Montana for over a week to shoot birds mostly, and some mammals. And I took my Canon R3 and the 100 to 500 with the 1.4 times teleconverter. Sometimes I had it on, the teleconverter, sometimes I didn't. And I shot my birds and mammals. And how did it go? Did this combination do the job for me? Well, that's what this is about. That's what this video is about. I'm not going to give it away. At the end of the video, I'm going to have a bunch of images and some video that I took with the R3 and this combination. And you can see for yourself whether it performed well. And I will tell you this, that, oh, well, maybe it did well, but the light was always good. The birds were always really close. No, the light was poor most of the time in both locations. But anyway, that's what this video is about. So if you want to know, not just how it went, but I will go over the settings I had the R3 set to. So I'll go into the menu system, show you exactly how I had my R3 set up. Also the lens, not a whole lot of settings there. It's really just about the IS settings. And then I will talk about my philosophy in using the autofocus system on the R3, which is very flexible, and I think, if not the best autofocus system out there, it is very close or equal to any autofocus system that's on a camera right now that I would consider using for birds and mammals, birds in flight included. So I will talk about my philosophy in when I use various autofocus methods, let's call them that. Let's say spot versus eye detection versus zone. So I'll talk about that. So if you're interested in knowing more, see how this all went, stay tuned. Okay, we're back. And what we're going to do first is we're going to jump into the menu system of my Canon R3, and we're going to go through the menu, and I'll show you exactly how I had my camera set up for not only the still images I took, but also for the video I took. And then, well, I'll cover that right now. The lens part. Basically, and people still seem to get confused a bit about this, I had the lens set on full autofocus. There's a focusing limiter on there. There's a switch on here, and it says full as one setting and 3 meters to infinity as another. I always have it set on full because I don't know how close things are going to get. So if you set it on full, you're going to be able to get as close a focus as you possibly can. And people say, yes, but that means it's going to cycle further. It's not going to be as fast. It's plenty fast, for me anyway. Set on full. I've never had much of an issue with the R3 and this lens on focusing quickly enough or cycling too much or anything like that. So it's set on full. Of course, it's set on autofocus most of the time. And then the thing that people still get somewhat confused about is the stabilization modes, 1, 2, and 3. Let's go over them one more time. Mode 1 is for static subjects, perched bird, for example. Mode 2 is for panning, anytime you're going to need to pan, and that's even a slow-moving swimming duck or something like that, versus the fastest thing that you can think of panning with, like a swallow in flight, something like that. And then you have mode 3, which really I hardly ever use anymore, and that's for something that's really erratic. The thing about mode 1 and mode 2 is that it stabilizes the viewfinder for you when you're looking through the camera and you have autofocus basically initiated and it's autofocusing and the stabilizer's on and all that kind of stuff. It stabilizes not only your view, but the view that the autofocus system is seeing. Makes it much easier to stay on your subject, get on your subject initially, all that kind of stuff. Mode 2 is for panning. I still see people trying to pan and they're on mode 1. Mode 2 on this lens with this camera. Mode 1 on this lens, this camera. Very, very strong image stabilization, combining both the IS in the lens and the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization in the camera. So if you have it set to the wrong mode for what you're trying to do, you're going to struggle a bit. Maybe you're going to struggle a lot if you're trying to pan and you're set to mode 1. So make sure you're set to the correct mode for what you're doing. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the setup of the lens. But let's dive into the menu of the camera and I'll show you how I had my R3 set up for both my Spain tour and my Montana tour. Okay, here we are in the menu of my Canon R3 and we're going to go through everything. And I'll try to explain why I have things set the way I have them set. Hopefully you'll understand why I have things set the way I have them set. We're not going to go through everything. I'll skip over a lot of stuff that isn't really important, but here we go. So, first thing, image size, type, C-RAW. You could go to RAW. I shoot C-RAW. I've not seen any difference shooting RAW versus C-RAW with image quality. What you can do with the images in post-processing. C-RAW divides, basically, it cuts the size of each file that you get, each image file, by almost half. Sometimes half, so you get better buffer performance. You don't hit the buffer as quick. You can put more images on a card, things like that. So it just makes sense to shoot C-RAW for me. So that's where we are. Of course, cropping and aspect ratio set to full. We're not going to do any of these other things in here. I want the full-size images. Moving on, all of this stuff, you can take a look at it. Set to off. I don't like a lot of other stuff going on in the background. Keeps things as fast as possible. Lets the processor focus on the most important things. At least that's the way I look at it. Again, most of this stuff, not an issue for the performance of this camera. For birds, mammals, birds in flight with the 100 to 500 on it. White balance, I set to a Kelvin value. Again, I like consistency in how my images look. I don't want auto white balance changing things on me. Not a big deal for performance, but there's the setting for you. Color space, Adobe RGB, widest color gamut possible for whatever you want to look at. And then picture style neutral. When you look at your pictures on the back of the screen, the LCD screen, or through the viewfinder, they may not look quite as sharp. They may not look saturated with colors and stuff like that, but it's the raw file. And I want to see what the raw file, for the most part, is looking like. So I leave it set to neutral. You can go in here and set it to other things like landscape and fine detail, and it's going to start adding contrast and sharpening and all that kind of stuff. But I just want to look at the raw, basically, as close to what it really looks like. So that's why I have it set to neutral there. Clarity again, and all this kind of stuff set to basically null value or 0. None of this has anything to do with anything that we're talking about here. Again, here, we're not doing any multiple exposures or focus bracketing or anything like that. Panning assist. Just did a video on that. You're not using that. That's for sure. Okay, 7. Drive mode. set to H plus right now. Did I have it on H plus all the time? Yeah, pretty much. We'll talk about a technique in a minute when I'll bring up an image later on, a couple images of a specific species and the shooting conditions I was in, and why H plus can be really, really important when you're really not trying to capture really fast action. It's not always a reason to use it. There's other reasons, and we'll get into that. All this other stuff. Oh, shutter mode, electronic. So I did something else during this 2 long tours I did. I shot hummingbirds on electronic shutter. Really fast wing beats. You'd think, wow, rolling shutter is going to be an issue here. It's going to detach the wings. Wings are going to be really deformed. Interesting what happened there. We can talk about that later on. Nothing here really that's important. Image simulation, display simulation. Yes, exposure simulation. I want to see my exposures when I'm looking through the viewfinder. One of the big benefits of mirrorless cameras. Shooting info display, all this kind of stuff, not important. Display performance, though, is important. Should be set to smooth, not power savings. Refresh rate of the viewfinder goes way up. Autofocus, servo, always, almost always. I never really use manual focus. I haven't found it to be necessary to tweak. Servo, autofocus area, we change that, right? As our shooting scenarios change, we change our autofocus area that we're using. We'll go into that, like I said earlier, in the introduction to this video. My philosophy for when and why I use the different autofocus areas. Subject tracking, in this case, is turned off, but again, I turn it on and off. These are settings that vary depending on shooting scenario. Right now it's off for whatever I was doing last. Animals, subjects to detect. Animals in this case. I have eye detection enabled right now, but, you know, again, it's one of those things you turn on and off depending on what's happening. Switching track subjects right now, set to 0, initial priority. I almost always have it set to initial priority because of the way I track things, the way I work in the field. Generally, once it gets the subject that I want, I don't want anything to interfere with that. I don't want the camera looking to switch track subjects. Okay, this is something that I've talked about in the past. What case do I use? I use case A now, auto, on the R5, on the R3, on the R7, on the R6 II. I use auto. It works really great. It's automatically sensing what's going on out there, changing the sensitivity of tracking, an XL decel of what's going on when you're tracking things. It's something you can't do quickly. When things change, like a bird's perch starts flying, all this kind of stuff, you can't change this quickly. But now the camera can sense what's happening, a change in how you're shooting, and it will change the sensitivity of these things on the fly. So I like auto. It's been working really, really well for me. All this stuff in here, the Autofocus 3 menu, not really important. Preview autofocus is disabled. That's the only thing I'll say. Again, nothing in here is really important to the functioning of things. Here neither. Nothing going on here. Nothing going on here. Okay. What am I going to say about the playback menu? Not a lot going on here. Nothing that we really need to talk about, except for highlight alert and autofocus point display. I like to have those enabled. It gives me some information to work with. I can talk about anything in this menu. Now, the wrench menu, auto switch cards for recording options for pictures. Talked about this in the past several times. I like to switch cards automatically because that's the main thing that can really hurt me I'm not worried about backing up my images in real time in the field. Now, I will say this. On my R3 now, I'm using a 1 terabyte card, or I use 1 terabyte cards, because I'm shooting video a lot more and stills. This way, with a 1 terabyte card, I don't really have to worry about my cards filling up in the field and having to change them. So the auto switch card thing has become less important, but I still have it set that way. Now, for me, in the field, I don't want to have to change batteries. I don't want to have to change cards, because you know what happens. The best action of the day happens, of the morning, of whatever happens when you have to change something, when you have to stop, change a battery, change cards. By using either a battery grip on a camera that doesn't have a big battery, the R3 has a big battery, so you don't have to worry too much about running out of battery, and also using big cards like 1 terabyte cards now that aren't all that expensive anymore, you don't have to really worry about those things anymore. The least I have to worry about in the field, the better I am, the more I can concentrate on getting the images I'm out there to get. So anyway, I won't say anything more about that. Nothing. Beep enabled. Again, it doesn't talk about the performance, but if you want to hear a fake shutter noise with the R3, have beep enabled, and then go to volume and have the shutter volume up a little bit, like I do here. Very, very quiet, but I like to be able to hear it. Screen brightness, all this kind of stuff. Not of any importance here. What is of importance is in this next menu, your custom functions menu, where we go over here to the 4th tab in customizing buttons and dials. Okay, this is how I have my Canon cameras set up, the ones with 3 buttons on the back, which is the R3, the R5, the R6 II. Not the R7, it only has 2 back button autofocus situation that you can set up there for the most part, but on my R3, which is what we're talking about here, this is how I have it set up, and to me, this is so important to be able to switch autofocus areas or methods as quickly as possible in the field. It will get you more shots, and we'll go over some image examples of where having an instant way to go from zone or eye detection to spot instantly just by moving my thumb got me images that I never would have been able to get before, not cycling through the different autofocus methods and then using the half. It just doesn't work as fast. So this is really important to how versatile and quick and accurate the autofocus system on the Canon R3 in this example is. So we go down to the autofocus on button. I have it set up to metering and autofocus start. This way, when I press the autofocus on button, it's going to use whatever autofocus area I have the camera in the main autofocus menu set to. Most of the time for me, it's a zone. The Canon R3 has flexible zones that you can change the size and shape of, and that is awesome to me. So generally, when I hit the autofocus on button, it's going to be set to a zone, and I'll have that zone available. We go down to the asterisk button. I have set the eye detection. I want eye detection at times. We'll talk about when, and I'll give some examples of when I use eye detection, and it's not when I think a lot of people really use eye detection for too many scenarios. And I think it hurts them sometimes. I think people just see eye detection and, oh my God, they just use eye detection all the time. Like it's good in every scenario. It's not, at least not for me. So we'll talk about that. But asterisk button goes directly to eye detection. And then my autofocus point selection button is set to register and recall a shooting function. And in there, I have it set up. We can go in there, go to info, and you can see that what I have is spot metering, and I have autofocus area set to spot autofocus. And that lets me initiate animal detection and have it initiate spot autofocus by having autofocus operation set to on when I hit the very right back button, which is the autofocus point select button. So this is the key, I think, to taking full advantage of the autofocus systems in these Canon cameras now, including the R3. Customized dials, not a lot going on here to customize things other than the control ring on the R5, on the control ring on the Canon 100 to 500 I have set to select my autofocus area, which I think is a very fast way to do it. Not changing that a whole lot these days. Like I said, that is the selection, the main autofocus area in your main autofocus menu. A quick way to select that without going into the menu itself, I have that set to zone almost always now. So the three autofocus methods I have available to me all the time via my three back buttons: zone, eye detection, spot. Okay, so that's really it. Those are the key things, along with some ancillary things that other people may find, or that people may find interesting or important to them. And so from here, we're going to go into talking about my way of shooting. When I used certain autofocus areas and why. So we just got done looking at the menu setup of my R3, and now we're going to talk about my philosophy, or how I use the different autofocus areas that I have set up on the three back buttons on my Canon R3. And the first thing we need to talk about, I think, is the use of eye detection. Because, of course, I see and I talk to a lot of people that shoot the same types of things I shoot, mostly birds, because of the tours I do. And I think a lot of people use eye detection like all the time. It's just an amazing thing. It's this new thing. It tracks throughout the entire frame. It finds the eye and the head and the body. And it does. It does a great job most of the time. The Canon R3's eye detection is really pretty amazing. But it's not God. It can't read our minds. It's not going to find the bird's eye or the head of a bird all the time in all scenarios. I hear people struggling often. It's not finding the eye. It's not getting the bird. I didn't get the shot. It's because I think they're using eye detection when they shouldn't be using eye detection. And so I wanted to cover eye detection first. And when do I use eye detection? To be honest, I don't use it all that much. I do use it. And I use it when eye detection is critical. When is it critical? It's when I have to have focus on the eye or the eye won't be sharp. And when is that? It's when you have very, very shallow depth of field scenarios. When you're shooting high focal lengths, which is most of the time with birds. But then bring in a subject very close. Because distance, the closer things are to the camera, your subject is to the camera, the less depth of field you inherently have. So now you have high focal length, subject very close. Maybe you're using an f4, an f2.8. Now your depth of field is really, really, really short, very shallow. If you don't get focus on the eye is not going to be covered by the depth of field range. It's not going to be sharp, and you may not be able to recover that with sharpening to get the detail you want in the face or the eye of your subject. I use eye detection when getting focus on the eye of my subject is absolutely critical. Otherwise, what do I use most these days? I use zone. And on the Canon R3, flexible zones. I can change the size and the shape of the zone to my heart's content. So I customize it to my shooting scenarios. And I use zone a lot because the algorithms are different for zone. Zones, why do you use a zone? You use a zone because there's dirty stuff in the background that will competing elements in there that will compete with the autofocus's attention. You can eliminate or limit greatly those distracting elements. Put your bird in that zone that is custom sized basically to what I need for my shooting scenario, and you're not giving the autofocus much chance to focus on anything else but your subject. And if you have eye detection turned on in the main menu, subject tracking is inherent with zone inside the zone, and you got eye detection turned on in the main menu, it's going to look for the head and the eye, but only within the zone. And that's really important. Those algorithms also look for wing flaps, different movement to identify the subject. So for me, under a lot of scenarios, zone is the way to go. I use zone the most. The second autofocus area method that I use the most is spot. One, because of how mirrorless autofocus systems work. They tend to get stuck on background or foreground elements sometimes. Spot right there on that third button instantly, right? Zone, eye detection, spot. That quick. Boo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. So, spot gets me off of that stuck situation when it happens, happening less often now for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just getting better at doing things. Second, though, is when you have a small bird in a bush or small bird amongst competing elements like grass or something like that, you put the spot on the bird's head or on the bird, you hit the button, and it's going to grab it almost every time. Once I have the bird identified, because by using spot and focusing on your subject, you're basically telling the camera's autofocus system what your subject is. Maybe I'll go to eye. Maybe it'll grab the eye if the bird's close enough. Maybe it'll grab the head, because it is looking for those shapes and stuff in there in the algorithms. A lot of times it'll grab it. Maybe I'll go to zone and it'll grab it. But spot is there when I need it to identify and sometimes stay on the subject amongst very crowded shooting scenarios when the bird is amongst a lot of competing elements that are close to or on the same focal plane as the bird itself or the subject itself. So it's zone, spot a lot, and then eye detection. Sure, you can use eye detection up against a blue sky or a smooth background and the bird's flying. Will it grab the bird just about every time? Sure. But then it drops down against something that's much closer to the focal plane of the bird that's competing with it, like ripply water and stuff, and I hear people complain that it lost the subject right when it got into a good scenario for the action that I really wanted. Well, zone may not have. Try to keep spot on the bird that whole time? Sure you can. It's what I used to do all the time with digital SLRs before all these fancy autofocus methods or areas or whatever you want to call them came along, tracking and all that kind of stuff. The problem with tracking, eye detection, with tracking autofocus systems is that they use the entire frame inherently. The R3 does. So if something competing comes into the frame somewhere, it may switch and off of your subject. So there you go. Eye detection is not God. It is not meant for every shooting scenario. If it were, there wouldn't be any other options in there. There would only be eye detection or subject tracking. There's a reason why there's still a spot, zones that can be changed size of, eye detect, all these different ways of doing it. All the different ways of using autofocus are still there because not one of them fits every scenario all the time. I am constantly now moving my thumb around as I'm shooting the same bird, but maybe moving in different types of areas and scenarios without really even thinking about it anymore. And by having those 3 back buttons set up the way I do and being able to do it almost instantly has just made it to, I've come to a point now where I rarely miss autofocus on something, just because that flexibility is there, and I've been using it long enough now, it's become ingrained in how I shoot. And I think that's what everybody should strive for. This is how I have things set up, but it may be better that you set it up things a little bit differently, but figure out what works for you, stick with it, get really used to it to where it all becomes muscle memory and you don't think about it. Because once you stop thinking about these types of things, autofocus and all that, you're going to start thinking about your subject, composition, lighting, all that kind of stuff, and you're going to make better images more often. That is how I set up and use my autofocus system in my Canon R3. The next thing I want to talk about is something I mentioned earlier in a video, and that's a shooting scenario I found myself in, and that has to do kind of going back to this system of a relatively slow lens like the Canon 100 to 500. People say 7.1 at 500, that's slow, no good for dim light. Canon R3. It was black woodpeckers in Spain. It was early morning, in the woods, low light, almost dark. I'm shooting at 1/10 of a second, 1/15 of a second, 1/50th of a second on a bird that's not flying, but it's bopping around in there, foraging in different areas. How am I going to photograph that? An f4 would have been better? Yes and no, but I didn't have my f4. Can you do it with this? That's the question. I did. I talked about having my frames per second set to H+, as fast as you can get given the shutter speed you're shooting. I made a conscious decision. This isn't spray and pray what I'm going to talk about here. It's a conscious decision, so it's a technique, it's a strategy for shooting in a scenario that I was in. High frames per second, lock onto your subject, spot a lot of times because of the low light, then eye detection sometimes once it got a little brighter, and shooting as many frames as I could, rattling off shots, because the strategy I was using was one of probability. The more shots you shoot in a series, when the bird is in a position you want it in, the more likely you're going to be completely steady at one point, using IS, of course, set to 1. You're going to be completely steady, the camera's going to stabilize things enough, and your bird or your subject's going to be steady, and out of a series of 60 or 70 shots, you get 3 or 4 that are tack sharp. So I shot a lot of images that morning to get the shots that I wanted, and I did get the shots that I wanted. Sharp shots, you can see them. It's a strategy you can use, and I probably would have been using the same strategy if I had my 600 f4. I could have been shooting a little bit faster shutter speeds because of the wider aperture I could have gotten with my 600 f4, but I still would have been using the same strategy of probability to make sure that I got as many situations captured where I was steady, the camera was steady, and the bird was totally steady with these very slow shutter speeds, so I could get my exposures up where I wanted them. So there are different ways to do things. Like I said, a lot of times you use H+, you shoot very fast frames per second because you're trying to capture a bird in flight, some action that's very fast, that's happening quickly, and you want to make sure you capture that exact moment. Well, here's another reason to shoot as fast of frames per second as you can, getting the probability up of getting when you're stable, subject stable, and you get that tack sharp shot at shutter speeds as low as 1/15th or 1/30th of a second. So there's that, right? So at this point, I think I've covered everything I really want to cover, other than showing you some images and videos that I took in Spain and in Montana, so that you can come to your own conclusion about whether this system right here, the Canon R3 with the Canon 100 to 500, did the job. It did the job. I think you'll see. At least I was happy with what I got out of it. Again, because the camera itself is so good, higher ISOs, limiting the noise. The pixel quality on this camera is high, so that even if you have to crop in a little bit, great realized resolution on your subjects. This lens is sharp, even with the 1.4 times teleconverter on it. It gives you great resolution. this combination is fast on autofocus, accurate on autofocus, even with the 1.4 times teleconverter attached to it. So all in all, it worked really, really well. For me, I'm definitely not buying the fact that a relatively low resolution camera at 24 megapixels with a relatively slow lens at 500 millimeters at f7.1 can't do the job in low light and good light, can't do the job for birds and mammals, and be basically your primary setup. I'm not buying it. I did it. I do it. And I'm happy with it. Am I going to get rid of my 600 f4? Nope, I'm not. Because there are times when I want it. But traveling with that 600 f4, a $13,000 lens, is nerve-wracking. It's big, it's heavy, it's hard to get on planes, especially international flights and things like that now. We all know that. Talked about it. It's so nice to travel with something so light and small as this. Don't not try this if you're looking for something that's relatively portable, very portable, small, light. It can do the job in my experience. So there you go. Hey, until next time, be safe, have great light, take great images, and I hope you enjoy the images and videos you're about to see. Thanks, and see you soon.